Enjoy our spine-chilling stories as you sleep, commute, or relax. If you're new, hit subscribe and share with friends and family. Let us know in the comments how we can improve. Our stories are best experienced with headphones on. Now, let's dive into today's tale.
Warning: the following stories contain elements of horror that explore themes of the supernatural, possession, psychological terror, and gruesome transformations. They are intended for mature audiences and may not be suitable for those sensitive to graphic imagery or themes of death, entrapment, and eternal damnation. Listener discretion is advised. Story 1. The Boy Who Wasn't Sebastian. The air was crisp and damp as I drove George to his first sleepover since we'd moved to this quiet, tree-lined town. My husband's job had uprooted us, but George, ever the social butterfly, had adapted effortlessly. His new school was a godsend, full of bright, polite kids and parents who seemed genuinely kind. So, when Maggie, the mother of George's friend Sebastian, suggested a sleepover to smooth over a recent incident at school, I agreed without hesitation. The incident had puzzled me. George, my sweet, talkative boy, had apparently struck Sebastian with an eraser, knocking him down. It was so unlike him. When I'd pressed him, his explanation had chilled me. Sebastian had tricked him, whispering threats to make George play along in a twisted game of pretend. The principal dismissed it as childish roughhousing, but something about it gnawed at me. Maggie, however, was warm and apologetic over the phone, admitting Sebastian had behavioral quirks, but assuring me he was harmless. I wanted to believe her. After all, George needed friends, and I didn't want to be that overprotective mother. Maggie's house was a charming, if slightly weathered, Victorian on the edge of town, its paint peeling like old skin. Inside, the warmth of her smile put me at ease. We sipped wine in her cozy living room, the walls adorned with faded family portraits, while the boys' laughter echoed from the basement. Maggie confided in me about Sebastian's struggles, difficulty making friends, occasional episodes where he seemed like a different person. "The doctors say he'll outgrow it," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. I nodded, trying to be supportive, but a flicker of unease stirred in my chest. Still, I left that night, kissing George goodbye as he and Sebastian played Battleship on the basement floor, their faces lit by the dim glow of a single bulb swinging overhead. The next morning, George was waiting by the door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, a tight smile on his face. Maggie waved cheerfully from the porch, but as we drove away, George's facade crumbled. Tears streamed down his face, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "Mom, something's wrong with Sebastian." My heart sank. "What happened, honey?" He described the night in halting whispers. They'd set up air mattresses in the basement, the cold concrete floor seeping through the thin fabric. Everything was fine until the dead of night, when George woke to a faint, flickering light spilling from the cracked bathroom door down the hall. It wasn't the harsh buzz of a fluorescent bulb, but a warm, unsteady glow, like a candle dancing in a draft. Then came the whispering, a low, urgent murmur that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. At first, George thought Sebastian was on the phone, but the words were strange, disjointed, and spoken in two distinct voices. One was Sebastian's, high and childish. The other was deeper, gravelly, calling itself Mr. Jim George, lay frozen, his eyes locked on the bathroom door as the candlelight snuffed out, plunging the basement into darkness. Minutes later, he heard the creak of hinges, followed by soft, deliberate footsteps padding across the concrete. The whispering resumed, closer now, hovering right above his face. The words were unintelligible, a guttural chant that didn't sound like any language George knew. He squeezed his eyes shut, his heart hammering, too terrified to move, until finally the footsteps retreated, and Sebastian, or whoever it was, returned to his mattress. In the morning, Sebastian acted as if nothing had happened, cheerfully offering George cereal and asking if he wanted to play more games. George didn't dare ask about Mr. Jim. I was horrified. My mind raced. Had I left my son in danger? I called Maggie, my voice shaking, demanding answers. At first she laughed, nervously, insisting Sebastian was just imaginative. But as I pressed, her tone shifted, her words spilling out in a frantic rush. He's not dangerous, I swear. One doctor mentioned dissociative identity disorder, but we're handling it. Please don't tell the school. We've already had to move twice because of misunderstandings. I hung up, torn between sympathy and fury. How could she not warn me? I vowed to decide by week's end whether to report her, but fate intervened. On Monday, Sebastian attacked another student at recess, this time with a violence that left the boy bloodied. The school sent a vague email citing disciplinary action, but whispers among parents confirmed Sebastian's expulsion. I tried calling Maggie, but her phone was disconnected. Driven by a mix of anger and morbid curiosity, I drove to her house days later, only to find it empty. No furniture, no moving trucks, just a hollow shell, as if they'd vanished into thin air. Years have passed, and George has moved on, the incident a distant memory for him. But I can't forget. I've searched online, scouring public records, social media, anything to trace Maggie and Sebastian, but it's as if they never existed. Late at night, when the house is silent, I think about that basement, about Mr. Jim, and what might have happened if George had opened his eyes. And then, just last month, I found something that turned my blood to ice. A crumpled note in a pocket of George's old sleepover backpack, one I hadn't touched in years, and a shaky, unfamiliar scrawl. It read, "Mr. Jim says goodnight. Story 2. The woman who wasn't my mother." Growing up in a Southern Baptist household, I was taught to fear not ghosts, but demons, dark biblical forces that could possess a soul and twist it into something unrecognizable. My mother, however, was indifferent to faith, shrugging off church with a wry, "God and I have an understanding." Her detachment widened the chasm between us, especially as her struggles with addiction and mental illness deepened. Some days she was functional, even loving. Others, she was a stranger, her eyes wild, her voice a sharp, unhinged edge. I told myself it was schizophrenia, a rational explanation for her chaos. But part of me, the part shaped by sermons and scripture, wondered if it was something darker. One afternoon, I woke from a nightmare so vivid it clung to me like damp rot. In the dream, my mother stormed into my room, her face contorted with rage, grabbing my wrist and shaking me. As she screamed, "You can't hide from me!" I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my body rigid with fear. But before I could shake it off, the door slammed open, and there she was. Same expression, same unhinged fury, same words, as if the dream had bled into reality. I shoved her away, yelling for her to stop, and she froze, her eyes glazing over before she stumbled out. The next morning, she had no memory of it, her confusion genuine, her hurt palpable. I told myself it was coincidence, a trick of my exhausted mind, but the unease lingered, a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. Weeks later, I found her in the backyard, her screams piercing the humid air, not cries of panic, but an eerie, excited wail that made my skin crawl. She stood in the grass, grinning, clutching a massive, writhing snake in her bare hands. My mother, who'd always recoiled at even the sight of a snake on TV, now held it aloft like a trophy, her eyes gleaming with a manic delight. "Come here," she cooed, motioning for me to take it. I staggered back, my voice trembling. "Mom, what the hell?" But her smile only widened, her head tilting at an unnatural angle, as if she were a puppet on strings. I fled inside, slamming the door, my heart hammering as I peered through the window. She stood there, unmoving, the snake slithering from her grasp, her gaze locked on the house. Hours later, when I confronted her, she shrugged, insisting I'd imagined it, her voice light, dismissive. Church became my refuge, a sanctuary of predictable, normal people. That winter, during an overnight lock-in, I felt safe, cocooned in the chapel's warmth, the murmurs of my friends lulling me toward sleep. But at 4:30 a.m., a loud, rhythmic knocking shattered the silence, echoing through the stone walls. It wasn't random. It circled the building, deliberate, impossible, as if something were testing every door, every window. My friends froze, their wide eyes reflecting my own dread. The pastor, asleep in his office, stumbled into the chapel just as the knocking ceased, his face paling as he opened the front doors. There, barefoot, in the freezing night, stood my mother, her clothes disheveled, her hair dripping with sweat despite the icy air. Her lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear, her gaze locking onto me with an intensity that turned my blood to ice. A slow, unsettling smile stretched across her face, and she stepped forward, her bare feet leaving wet, glistening prints on the stone floor. The pastor tried to hold me back, whispering, "Stay here." But my legs moved of their own accord, drawn to her as if by some invisible thread. The drive home was silent, her eyes fixed on the road, her hands gripping the wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. At home, she stopped in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim streetlight, and stared at me, unblinking, as I retreated to my room. I locked the door, lying awake, listening for her footsteps, but hearing only the creak of the house settling, or so I told myself. In the morning, she was in the kitchen, humming cheerfully, cooking breakfast as if nothing had happened. "I was just about to pick you up," she said, startled to see me. Her confusion so genuine, it made my stomach lurch. She had no memory of the night, no recollection of the knocking, the drive, the stare. No one at church spoke of it, their silence heavy, as if they feared acknowledging it would make it real. Years later, after she passed, I tried to rationalize it, mental illness, addiction, withdrawal, but the memories gnaw at me, the coincidences too precise, the shifts in her too sudden. And then, last month, I found something that shattered my fragile logic, tucked in an old box of her things. It was a photograph I'd never seen, a grainy Polaroid of the backyard, taken the day of the snake incident. In it, my mother stood, grinning, the snake coiled around her arms. But behind her, in the shadow of the oak tree, was a figure, tall, indistinct, its face a blur, but its eyes sharp, piercing, staring directly at the camera. On the back, in her handwriting, were the words, "He says, I'm free now." Story 3, The Mirror in the Wall. When my eldest son, Ethan, started sleepwalking at 8, I dismissed it as a phase. Kids do strange things, right? I'm a light sleeper, so I'd always catch him, standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes open but vacant, staring through me into some unseen void. It was unsettling, sure, but I'd guide him back to bed whispering his name, and by morning he'd have no memory of it. Sometimes he'd mumble soft, slurred words I couldn't decipher, his breath slow and steady, almost too steady, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. Months later, things escalated. I woke to a rhythmic tapping, like water dripping onto glass, but the night was dry, the house silent save for that deliberate, measured sound. It came from the hallway, steady, precise, not the random creak of an old house, but something intentional. I slipped out of bed, my husband snoring softly, and stepped into the dim corridor. There was Ethan, facing the wall, his forehead knocking against it in slow, even taps, his fingertips grazing the wallpaper in rhythm, as if he were trying to push through to the other side. The air felt thick, heavy, the shadows pooling unnaturally around him. I called his name, my voice barely a whisper, but he didn't react, his movements mechanical, almost ritualistic. I hesitated, a chill crawling up my spine before shaking him gently. He blinked, stepped back, and let me lead him to bed, his face blank, as if nothing had happened. It happened a few more times, always the same spot, same eerie rhythm. But eventually, he outgrew it, and I pushed it to the back of my mind. A strange but harmless quirk. That is, until my younger son, Caleb, started doing the same thing years later, at the same age, in the same exact way. I told myself it was genetics. Kids mimic behaviors, even unconsciously. But the details gnawed at me. Caleb hadn't seen Ethan sleepwalk. Ethan had stopped years before Caleb was old enough to remember. Yet there he was, standing in the hallway, shifting foot to foot, his unfocused eyes staring through me, his forehead tapping the wall. In that same sickening rhythm. The air felt colder this time, the shadows deeper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. One night, I woke to the tapping again, louder, more urgent, echoing through the house like a heartbeat. I found Caleb in the hallway, his small body swaying, his forehead striking the wall with a force that made me wince. A faint smear of blood marking the wallpaper. I grabbed his shoulders, shaking him, but he didn't wake, his lips moving, whispering words I couldn't understand. Guttural, ancient, not English. Panic surged through me, and I dragged him back to bed, my hands trembling. The next morning, he had no memory of it, his forehead unmarred, as if the blood had been a trick of the light. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't explain why both my sons, years apart, had been drawn to that exact spot, as if something unseen were calling them. Years passed, the sleepwalking faded, and the house grew quiet, with both boys away at college. To fill the silence, my husband and I decided to renovate. New floors, new paint, a fresh start for our old, creaky home. We were stripping the hallway wallpaper, peeling back decades of faded floral patterns, when we found it, a large, antique mirror embedded in the wall, its ornate frame tarnished, its glass clouded with age. My breath caught. Why would someone cover a mirror instead of removing it? And then it hit me. This was the exact spot where my sons had tapped, where they'd tried to push through, as if drawn to something beyond the wall, something inside the glass. I felt ridiculous, staring at a piece of glass, but the unease was palpable, the air around it thick, oppressive, as if the mirror were exhaling something ancient, something wrong. My husband laughed it off, but I insisted we remove it. As we pried it from the wall, a folded piece of paper slipped from behind the frame, yellowed and brittle. It was a newspaper clipping from 1923, the headline stark: "Local man vanishes after claiming mirror speaks to him." The article described a man who'd lived in our house, who'd installed the mirror after becoming obsessed with voices he claimed came from within it. He'd disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the mirror, which his family later covered, too afraid to destroy it. We smashed the mirror that night, the shards glinting in the moonlight, but the unease didn't lift. And then, last week, I woke to a sound I hadn't heard in years. Tapping, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from the hallway. My heart sank as I stepped into the corridor, expecting to see nothing, hoping it was just the house settling. But there, in the exact spot where the mirror had been, was a faint, shimmering outline on the wall, like a reflection without a source. And in the silence, I swear I heard it. A whisper, soft, guttural, calling my name.
If you're new, hit subscribe and share with friends and family. Let us know in the comments how we can